This is the experience of buying a video game. Or at least it was. Pick out a game from the store, take it home, pop it into your console, and you are experiencing a work of art at your fingertips. What you own is a physical representation of multiple people's hard work and creative minds realized in the form of a complete and interactable package. This piece of art is a complete product that now belongs to a happy player, as the artists behind it move on to their next ambition. This was the standard experience of a game's production. People often look back at their young adult or childhood years of gaming and refer to them as the glory days or better times. Things aren't the way they used to be. But what if that isn't just an opinion? Are those nostalgia-tinted glasses not doing all the heavy work? Maybe the legend is true. Games have become a lot more advanced since the jump to HD consoles like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Online play was a new standard, and genre-defining titles were able to be realized with more powerful hardware. Fast forward to today, where AAA titles are absolutely massive, not just in scope, but often in file size, requiring a hefty download when you insert the disc into the console. Yet, when some of these new releases come out, something feels off. Despite having a hefty download, there's something that feels incomplete about this game. Perhaps a lack of content? A quantity of glitches, or hefty monetization. Somehow this fully wrapped package is missing something. With the state of a hefty number of games in the 8th and ninth generation of console titles have launched in, it's clear that there's been a noticeable decline in overall polish in the gaming industry. Games have only gotten more advanced, so how did we get to this point? Strap in. We're going on a journey through time, from the old days where Nintendo saved the gaming industry to the standardization of large game downloads. This is the decline of game polish.
My first ever video game console was the N64. It wasn't what I was supposed to grow up with. If I go by what everyone else my age grew up with, it was the GameCube. I went from the N64, played that for a long time, up until the Wii came out. And that's what I grew up with.
I'm 20 years old and I'm very passionate about film and stuff. Film is what I'm trying to get into. But I am a gamer. Like, I had experience developing games at some point in my life, primarily middle school. And I may also start developing some games with some friends who are doing it on the side. Whether it be directing the project or writing the story. Funnily enough, before I got into actual gaming, I had a Leapster and would play Flash games on the computer. That was my first experience playing games, period. My cousin sold the Nintendo Wii that they had to my mom, and that was the kickoff point. I officially owned a real video game console and was officially getting games as gifts and such.
I think the first console we ever got was a Wii, and it was sailing from there. I always had the question of how did they work whenever I played, and it was always fascinating to me how to learn the insides. I never really did that much as a kid, but it's rooted pretty far back.
Let's go back to 1985. The video game crash of 1983 is still very apparent. The market is filled with an oversaturation of lackluster console titles. E.T. the Extraterrestrial released to incredibly lackluster reviews on the Atari. Even the beloved Pac-Man got a botched port to the Atari. Perhaps video games aren't the new hot hobby they were cracked up to be. On October 18th, 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System released in the United States. With it came Super Mario Bros. what's this? Bright, colorful graphics? Catchy music? Tight level design? Fun gameplay? This feels like an arcade-quality game that could be played in the comfort of a living space. It sold millions, received massive praise, and showed that gaming might not be the lost cause everyone thought it was. In a way, Super Mario Bros. Saved video games. In a sea of unsatisfying home console titles, Super Mario Bros. Provided the content, polish, and replayability to capture the hearts of millions. Nintendo's run on the NES showcased how video games aren't just designed to be fun, but how they're also works of art. The Legend of Zelda is inspired by creator Shigeru Miyamoto's experiences exploring the woods when he was younger. Metroid is heavily based on popular sci-fi franchises like Alien. Nintendo's effect on gaming would also affect how other companies develop games, like how Capcom's Mega Man was influenced heavily by Astro Boy. With how Nintendo changed the industry, it created a steep competition for other companies to try to capture that same magic. Another company, Sega, made a huge leap in their next generation of video game consoles to attempt to rival Nintendo with their own console seller in the form of Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. A game that would feature stunning cartoon graphics, a funky soundtrack, and momentum-based gameplay unlike anything anyone's ever seen at the time. With the Sonic the Hedgehog game, a sequel that would go on to sell millions, and a host of other Sega franchises, Sega became a worthy opponent to Nintendo in the fourth generation of consoles, even exceeding them in sales over the Super Nintendo Entertainment System at one point. This rivalry would spawn even greater games in the industry at the time, with Nintendo's upgraded sequels to NES classics and Sega's host of new franchises. All of these games were complete and fun. Whether you owned an SNES, a Sega Genesis, or future consoles in the 90s like the Nintendo 64 or another new competitor in the form of Sony's PlayStation, it was an exciting time to be a fan of video games. There was nothing quite like taking home the brand new Legend of Zelda game on the Nintendo 64 and inserting it into the console and being greeted with a wondrous title screen, setting up a massive adventure, or firing up the disc for the latest Crash Bandicoot game to see what kind of crazy levels Naughty Dog came up with on the PlayStation.
Getting a new game for the Wii felt like I was about to go on a brand new adventure. I remember Mario Galaxy was pretty much always there, but when I got Mario Galaxy 2, that was an amazing experience. That's one of the first games I remember. I got it new, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
When I got a new game, it was a relatively rare experience, and whether or not I would play it a lot was determined based on what kind of game it was. And I didn't even know how to read while playing these games, so these games were practically my virtual playground. I would just go and experience what it was like to play around in them rather than finishing levels, 100%ing them, reading text boxes, because that sort of thing was just not registering up in my brain. It was a very exciting experience, and when it wasn't, I didn't really think about it. I was just going to go back to playing Toy Story 3 on the Wii or something like that.
Were there games that came out of significantly lower quality than others? Sure there were. But even if certain games didn't receive as glowing reviews as others, it is always a fun experience finding a new game at the store and running home to play a fantastical piece of art. Let's fast forward a little bit. The latter half of the 2000s were an interesting shift in video games. While Nintendo was experimenting with new types of control with the Wii to great success, the competition, like Xbox and PlayStation, released consoles capable of high-definition graphics for games that make their previous works pale in comparison on a visual and scope level. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 served as one of the greatest console generation leaps in gaming history, and with it, It was fascinating to see beloved franchises like Halo and Ratchet and Clank make the jump to high-definition graphics. What we're about to look at here is a topic that many video game fans do not like to look back on. Sonic the Hedgehog was still a relatively beloved franchise despite changing drastically since the Sega Genesis days. Due to low sales, Sega hopped off the console market in the early 2000s to become a third-party producer. Franchises like Sonic and Jet Set Radio would make their debuts on their competitors' consoles, turning fierce rivals into supportive friends. With the jump to HD consoles, millions were anticipating Sonic's transition to this new era of gaming in the form of 2006's Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog was meant to introduce a new era of the Sonic franchise to new fans, similar to how the Sega Genesis Sonic made an impact on the industry. There was a lot of hype behind this new Sonic the Hedgehog game. When it finally released in November of 2006, word of mouth quickly spread on the game's state. The game was blasted by critics and fans alike for being a glitchy, unpolished dumpster fire of a game with muddy graphics, unsatisfying gameplay, a mess of a story, and an overabundance of long loading screens. All of these things combined showcased a significant lack of polish. The loading times in Sonic 06, which is what the majority of people started nicknaming the game, were unlike anything seen at the time for a AAA title. There have been a number of low-quality video games since the resurrection of gaming thanks to Nintendo, but seeing a franchise as beloved as Sonic the Hedgehog have their largest release to date launch in such a state was a shock to the entire gaming industry. The Sonic franchise is lucky to still have such a dedicated fan base to this day. The scars this game left are still felt by multiple game critics. Starting in this era of games, consoles are now able to connect to the internet by themselves, being able to browse the web, feature online multiplayer, and even the ability to download exclusive games digitally, and eventually even full games that would release at retail. Since consoles are now able to download things, games have been able to take advantage of this. If there were certain bugs that were left in the game, there would be online updates for the game that patch out said bugs to make an already good game even better.
Take, for instance, back in the cartridge days. They're stuck with those glitches and there's no way to fix them now. And hopefully it doesn't break the game, but you cannot fix those back then, and even nowadays you can't fix them. Now, if those kind of problems, like an unknown glitch, gets past all the play testing and the audience finds out about it, and then patches and little updates can be used to fix those, because now with the internet being able to directly link to everyone's copies of the game, it can now fix those problems. So that's a really good benefit of it.
You gotta really look back at how it started. Games that were finished or told a complete story or had a complete experience later would throw in extra content that you could pay a few extra bucks for, just to bring you back into the world, or just to offer more of an experience for the $60 you just spent, or however much it could have cost.
Games like Dark Souls and Skyrim were a critical success, but while those were quality and complete games, wouldn't it be exciting to have more of those games? Well, thanks to the ability of being able to connect to the internet, publishers could release post-launch downloadable content for said games for a price that would expand on the game even further. Dark Souls is a great example of this. The game was already a work of art, but with the game's DLC, the developers were able to expand the world of the game even further, not being a necessary addition to the game, but a heavily worthy one. This concept of DLC was exciting. Adding content to already existing games? Sounds awesome. Imagine Super Mario Galaxy getting a slew of brand new levels. Funnily enough, there was going to be an updated version of Super Mario Galaxy with more levels and features called Super Mario Galaxy More before the developers had so many more ideas that the content got retooled into a sequel to the game. The next Sonic title would get additional level packs for players to enjoy. Mega Man 9 and 10 would receive new playable characters in said games. Fighting games would add new characters on top of an existing roster. DLC has potential to make great games even better.
They've absolutely benefited the industry. They have. It allows the early access tag to even exist, period. We wouldn't have early access without it. DLCs can bring new life into games, or just a couple cosmetics. You don't have to buy them. And patches always can fix what's broken and what's absolutely broken that needs to get done and it was overlooked. But on the other hand, it can be abused, but overall, I think it's a great thing because I use it every day.
And yet, these exciting new game changers would affect how games are released in the coming generations.
I feel like now, after that sort of business model died out, game studios are looking for more and more excuses to tighten schedules and release product, fix it later. One of the best examples to use here, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 released, and you cannot play that game without getting the patch because they pushed out that game because they were about to lose the license to the series and they had no care whatsoever about releasing it. So basically, you would get the disc, put it in, let's say, an Xbox, and it would have to be a good 15 gigabyte patch because that was the entire game that they had to finish later after starting to sell it.
Updates, patches, DLC, these would both impact the industry for the better, but also for the worse. While stuff like patches were beneficial to fixing game-breaking bugs in games, that function would become exploited throughout the years. There's a larger number of games nowadays that release in very glitchy states and attempt to bring back the goodwill by patching out the glitches month down the line. Sometimes these games get middling to low reviews before fixing all the issues with said game months later. And other times, these games would get high review scores despite releasing in questionable states, with the assumption that all of the issues will be patched in future updates. And it's up in the air on whether or not those updates actually do come in a satisfying manner.
There is no denying it. There is what seems to be a downward trend in certain areas where the polish is gone, and it's sad. It definitely is. It's not the same as it used to be. They don't make them how they used to.
Remember those long loading times in Sonic 06? How much of a detriment that was to the game? Load times would often be that long, if not longer, for games of the 8th generation. One of the worst parts of one of the most infamous video games became a common occurrence for a while. Only up until recently was this an issue, but luckily we now have consoles with high-powered SSDs that can load even the largest games super quickly. How about those post-launch updates? These can either be used to add new additions to make an already good game even better for absolutely free, or other times they'll be treated as adding the rest of the game that already launched months later, disguised as free DLC. This makes sense when a game releases in a state known as early access, like on Steam, but you can tell a game is incomplete on release when it looks like it has a lackluster amount of content and proceeds to announce that free DLC is coming sometime after launch. There are cases where free content updates come out for already completed games, but oftentimes the games will come out unfinished or buggy, and then proceed to mask finishing the games with free content updates.
It gives them an excuse to release an unfinished game, to where they push it out and they're like, we want our money now and we'll fix the game later, which does not work and just angers the audience. I don't understand why they do it. There's a gray area, there's good, and there's bad. It's just the context on which the patches are being used. If it's used to actually fix a glitch that honestly got past everyone, then that's good. If they're using it as an excuse to fix a game just to get it out a year early, just to make their money, then that's just stupid.
Some games even not only follow the trend of launching with lackluster content, but also have the rest of it come in the form of paid DLC. Ever feel like a game didn't have enough content when it was released? Well, they can always make an extra buck by adding DLC that turns the game into a somewhat satisfying package that barely compares to the content of a game in the 2000s. Or, better yet, games will launch with a distinctive lack of content, and to get extra unlockables like extra skins or better weapons, paid microtransactions would become a thing to let people pay for the currency used in these games to get the chance to unlock these skins in softcore gambling. It's clear that these monetizable aspects have gotten out of hand. A game's launch is the most important day for that title, so when a massive game like Cyberpunk 2077 releases in a near unplayable state, then gets fixed a few years later to be in a finished and playable state, there's always that discussion related to it about how unpolished the game was when it first released, despite having a positive reception nowadays.
It just gives companies more of an excuse to pump out a $60 broken mess and try to fix it later down the line. But what that does, it really damages the good faith that you could possibly build with the consumer. A lot of people like to point at No Man's Sky, Cyberpunk, which did eventually turn around, but companies like CD Projekt Red, people will remember what happened. Cyberpunk came out and even had it was either a PS4 or an Xbox One exclusivity console, and the game just did not run on those platforms right at all. You had to have the new PS5 for a decent experience, and there were people who had the specs for PC and it just wouldn't run right.
When games were in production up until the late 2000s, games had to be completely finished on release since there were no patches or updates. If a game was glitchy or unpolished, it would stay glitchy or unpolished forever. While that sounds like an inconvenient thing, it encouraged companies and their developers to fix and resolve as many issues as possible before the release of their game. Now, since game updates are a thing, there's often the mentality of launching the game now to get the profit and fix it later after the game is already released to get back their goodwill. This also means that when you buy games physically nowadays, you aren't getting the full package in the box itself. What was once as simple as popping the game into your console, turning it on and playing, nowadays inserting a game's disc into a console often requires a large download, multiple if there are updates and DLC included.
Physically, all the time. Just because when you buy something digitally, sure, you paid for it with your own money and it says that you own it, but there are so many ways that digital games are just so much more vulnerable. The company itself that made the game on the console could just shut it down entirely and make it unplayable. That can still be done with physical games, but it's a lot harder to do that with physical games. And you physically own it. They literally had to take the game away from you to stop you from playing it. Or literally just update the software to where it does not play that game, which would be extremely petty and would not be a good idea to do.
This box here does not contain a complete work of art. It contains the license to play said art, allowing you to download it once the system reads the disc. This box I have right here contains an incomplete port of a game with numerous glitches and even seizure-inducing graphical bugs. That is what is being preserved on this cartridge. The slightly more playable version requires a download from the internet, and that is only one of many different cases. Even if a new game doesn't have an abundance of glitches, stuff like poor art direction, a lack of content, and overly bloated game file sizes made it apparent that game polish is decreasing.
Polish can go from like the way a game looks to the way a game plays and all sorts of stuff like that. It varies. I mean, just look at Mario 64, for example. There's a lot of glitches, but in that game, you actually have to try and get them, which shows that Nintendo really put a lot of effort into making that game as good as it is.
Nintendo is a very strict company when it comes to their properties, often being extremely protective of them, going as far as to shut down major tournaments and other fan projects. It often tends to harm their reputation. But what keeps people coming back to Nintendo products is that they have a high priority of releasing quality games. They do take advantage of updates and patches, but most of their games ensure that they are complete and in the box before shipping it out to the world. Nintendo isn't the only company that still sticks to this philosophy when releasing games. They themselves even dived into the finish it later approach briefly in the beginning of the Nintendo Switch era before stopping those kinds of releases in 2023. But their titles are one of the most commonly polished in the larger gaming industry today.
But I know Elden Ring and them have been amazing from what I've seen. Baldur's Gate, which I think is an indie studio published by AAA. But even so, that's another one. It's refreshing to see those kind of games, and it's such a diamond in the rough. At least to me, it's like, oh, this game is actually kind of like there was care put into this. Oh, okay, this is kind of cool.
With a lot of Nintendo Switch games, you'll still own the complete package 30 years down the line with these physical copies without needing to download anything to make it playable. Whereas that will not be the case with a large PlayStation 5 game where the updates will no longer be available on PlayStation servers in the very distant future. It's a safe bet that you can put a new Nintendo Switch game into the console and be able to play right away. This is one of the many things that has made them stick out in the industry throughout the years. Polished titles that tend to sell millions with each release. They haven't been completely free of unpolished titles, however. Certain releases like Mario Golf Super Rush, Nintendo Switch Sports, and Mario Strikers Battle League received less than favorable reviews from fans due to the lack of content for $60 on release and still not satisfying them after all of the post-launch content updates have rolled out. A number of Pokemon games made by different Pokemon companies have been released in states that don't live up to most of Nintendo's other first-party titles. While Nintendo isn't entirely in a minority of companies focused on releasing quality games, the way they release their games in complete packages is a reminder of how things used to work.
Super Mario Odyssey, that was one that I got. Because I didn't get the Switch when it first came out, but when I got it a couple of years later and I got Mario Odyssey, that's the most memorable because I spent so long with that game because it was like everything I enjoyed about all the previous Mario games I grew up with. Super Mario 64, Super Mario Galaxy, Galaxy 2. It was like all of those elements that made it great poured into this one. So it was great. That would be my most memorable experience of buying a new game.
It seems like many other aspects of the AAA industry are bloated with unfinished titles releasing now to make a quick buck or to gain the funds to finish it later. It tends to leave a question. What other good examples are there of companies releasing complete games like this? While it may not seem common in the larger game industry, the old mentality of crafting games has been passed on to new, inspiring developers.
So about me, my name is X-Ray, but my actual name is Tim. I've been in the industry for a little about 2.5 years, but you could arguably go back 3.5 to 4, doing mainly VR development and QA. So it's been very, very fun time working for a very small indie studio by the name of Kluge Interactive. We do Synth Riders, and as of right now, we're working on a game called Final Fury. I mentioned this a little earlier, but just the question of how does that work, and the endless challenges that when you finally dive into it, it gives you a challenge after a challenge, and it's very satisfying to work through that challenge and find something in the end that it's like, wow, this is really cool. Like, I made this. This is very interesting. I don't know, that feeling is something I always chase, and it's such a good feeling, especially when other people get to experience it. It's like, great.
A lot of big budget titles have employees crunching away to get a product out that is directed by someone higher up. While the result can often still lead to a lovingly crafted product, this toxic workforce can ultimately harm a potentially great game, leading to a rushed product that didn't have enough time to bake. You'd imagine the hardworking developers want the game to be the best it can be, but those higher-ups at the companies aren't looking for something to be proud of. They are looking for a profit. Indie developers have become more important than ever over the last decade and a half. New developers entering the game creation scene inspired by the works of several gems of the past. Indie developers have clear visions that are easier than ever to realize due to game creation softwares allowing game development at home.
My philosophy for making games and playing games as well run hand in hand with my aspirations for making film. I was telling somebody literally yesterday, like, I do not want to make too many things, like, let's say, I want to make too many movies that I wouldn't want to watch myself. I want to make things that I would want to play and watch,
As such, we've been getting games that rival or even outshine some of the most revolutionary games of our childhoods. Indie developers have their own set deadlines and their own schedules, so they can give themselves as much time as they need in order for their game to be as polished and complete as possible. It is entirely possible for a new indie release to outshine the release of a new AAA title. It's inspiring to see a smaller game with loads of inspiration gain a ton of traction online when it releases, or to have a singular game developer create an entire passion project by themselves in every aspect and launch it on Steam expecting a few thousand copies only to be treated with over 10 million copies sold.
When you get responses from people that get to play what you've worked on, you actually get to see them, and it's a lot more different than just going, oh, this game is great on like text. But when you get to see somebody go, you made something amazing, this is great, and it's great to have that visual and that auditory feedback at the same time to just keep you going, and especially when you're passionate about it, that just keeps you going and going. And this is my first journey into game development, being especially part of a game that I donated my time for 2 years as a beta tester, and if that doesn't say passion, I don't know what else does.
It's easy to fit a lot of indie games on a new game console, since a lot of them have condensed file sizes, so you can cram several incredible titles onto your Nintendo Switch or Steam Deck and play them all on the go. Nowadays, indie games have become such a respected medium in the game industry that some indie games are able to score special deals with companies like Limited Run Games to release physical copies of their game on store shelves with loads of goodies, and since their file size is so small, it's easy to fit their whole game on a cartridge or disc, being preserved forever in the consumer's little box. Video game enjoyers often now group indie games in their list of favorite games of said year they came out in. Stardew Valley in 2016, Hollow Knight in 2017. Celeste managed to join the nominees of Game of the Year at the Game Awards alongside the likes of Marvel's Spider-Man, Red Dead Redemption 2, and God of War. With the way indie developers are making games based off of their visions, wanting them to be in the best state possible, there's a lot to look forward to from the inspiring, creative minds of independent creators.
For years, this has been a problem, and everyone has said, we can wait. We want a good game. We understand that game development is a very tedious process and a very long process. It's just redundant how they haven't, if they would change that one thing, I guarantee you game polish and every problem that we have would be a lot better.
It is difficult to discuss what the future of gaming looks like when the AAA scene produces more stories of bad work environments, horrible layoff counts, and extreme crunch. It's easy to think that certain companies have lost their touch when the wondrous minds of several talented developers leave or get laid off from a beloved company. A lot of companies tend to be okay nowadays with releasing unfinished titles and face the backlash to gain the money they desire at an early time, proceeding to hire a team to clean up the bug-infested mess left behind by the publishers. It's clear that over the years, for each brilliant new feature the industry gains to help games be the best they can be, companies have retooled those features to benefit them financially rather than to benefit the game. Concepts that seemed exciting have now turned into eyebrow raisers. The indie scene seems to lack this concern. While not every indie game out there gets released pleasantly, it's much more common to see care put into these projects, as delays are more frequent and feedback from excited fans are easier to consider. The philosophies that spawned from years ago have carried on to aspiring developers creating new experiences for us to dig into.
They are out to make a game that is designed to be enjoyed by a specific type of person, and more often than not, those type of people show up to play. And in a case like Undertale or Pizza Tower, more people who didn't experience Earthbound or Wario Land show up in mass, and a whole new generation is falling in love with this gameplay that you used to really enjoy. You can't interact with an EA game and get a non-corporate response from them. But if you were to comment on Toby Fox's YouTube channel, there would be a chance he could reply to you, and it is him. The developer of Undertale is speaking to his community. You don't get that from mainstream AAA games, so that also helps.
It's always on paper. It's always starting on paper, but we always go from there and let's go into user testing after we implement it, and then we go. We always love getting feedback from people, so we get the feedback in, and it's because it's our community. We have some people internally, but we outsource it to some people that are really passionate about the game, and they're like, yeah, we like this feature, or no, we don't like this feature. So we take it right back and we adjust it.
What I find fascinating is just how indie developers put more into their games than big companies do. And it's that gives the audience something to latch onto, that is they actually care about making this game. That means this is going to be a good game. It's probably going to be simple, it's probably going to be short, but it's going to be an experience that the gamer is going to love.
If a bucket of new AAA games fail to meet expectations, there'll always be new faces ready to pursue their dreams. There has indeed been a decline of game polish, but there are talented individuals across the industry that are ready to rectify that decline.